So when we talk about ecology, one of the topics that comes into this is these relationships that different organisms have. So we've been talking in ecology about how different organisms affect their environment, how they affect each other, and so forth. And so one special sort of category of relationship between two organisms are called symbiotic relationships. And these are like symbiotic relation are very close relationships when two organisms are almost tied together in some way. And there's different versions of this. One type is called mutualism. And mutualism is a relationship when actually both of the species that are involved, they're both benefiting, they're both getting something positive out of the relationship. A great example of this is the termite. So you probably have heard of termites, and you probably know that they can eat through wood, and can basically destroy even a whole house if there's a bad termite infestation. Well, actually, the termite itself can't digest the wood that it chews up. Okay? It has actually, however, a mutualistic relationship. Inside of its digestive tract, there is a protist, a tiny little single-celled organism that lives. That organism can digest the wood. So the termite chews up the wood, swallows it. This protist living in its digestive system helps break down that wood. The termite in turn gets some nutrients from that wood that it otherwise couldn't have gotten. And the protist gets a nice little safe home, gets the termite to provide it with food by chewing up and swallowing the wood. So both of these organisms are benefiting, right? They're both getting something positive out of this relationship. That's an example of mutualism. They mutually benefit each other. Another type of symbiotic relationship is one that's called commensalism. And in commensalism, it's a little strange because one organism benefits from the relationship, but the other one is not really affected either way. It's not harmed, but it's also not really helped. An example of this is like a barnacle. You can see on this whale's flipper at the edge, there's some barnacles that have attached themselves there. They get a ride through the water. They can filter materials out of the water while they're attached there. Now, they're very small. They don't affect this huge whale. They don't impact it in any way. So the whale's not hurt. It's also not helped. But this barnacle is benefiting from the relationship. So this is an example of what we call commensalism. And then the third one is probably the one you're most familiar with, is parasitism. Parasitism is a symbiotic relationship when both organisms have this close interaction. But in parasitism, one organism benefits, we call that the parasite, and the other organism, which we call the host, actually is harmed. So one example here is the sea lamprey. So what you see here, these long things, these are lamprey. It's a type of fish. It's a jawless fish. They do live around here. They're invasive, these lamprey. They came to the United States from Europe and Asia. But these lamprey, this is what their mouth looks like. They basically attach to a large fish. They have a tongue which is like a drill. It has teeth on the tongue, and they basically kind of drill a hole into the side of the large fish, and then they live off of its blood. It's almost like a really, really large leech, but it's actually a fish. And so here you see a trout that has two lamprey attached to it. You could also see here on this trout a wound where there was once a lamprey attached. When I was in college, we went on a fishing boat in Lake Champlain up in Vermont. and we were catching fish to look at, and my professor was explaining we caught some lamprey in those, and so we got to see them. He actually put it on. He had this rubber apron. He put the lamprey on his rubber apron and just like attached and tried to drill a hole through it. But also when we caught large like lake trout out of Lake Champlain, we could see lots of them had the signs or the scars of where lamprey were once attached. Obviously, this harms the fish. It's taking nutrients, it's taking blood from it. The wounds can get infected. It's harder to swim and so forth. So the fish is being affected negatively, but this lamprey is obviously benefiting by consuming blood of this fish. Ticks are parasites, right? They can cause infection. Tapeworms in animals are examples of parasites. They live inside, they digest materials that the organism's eating. Heartworm, if you have a dog and you give it those little heart guard medicines every 3 months or whatever, those are to prevent a parasitic worm from getting into the heart of your dog and causing an infection. And my dog had tapeworms once, and did I tell you guys the story about when I gave my dog the deworming? Yes? No? And all the worms came out when she went to the bathroom. Yeah, it's pretty gross. So these are 3 types of symbiotic relationships. They're relationships in which organisms are closely tied. So when we learned about ecosystems, one of the things we talked about is that there are these abiotic and biotic factors, living and non-living things, and they interact with each other. And within an ecosystem, there are these different materials that move through the ecosystem in different ways. I'm going to talk about some of those. So the thing to know about ecosystem is that the material, the matter, the chemicals, the elements in those ecosystems, they do get recycled. Remember, energy doesn't get recycled. Energy comes in through the sunlight, moves from organism to organism, being lost along the way, 90% each level, but you always need new energy being input into the ecosystem in order for it to continue. Materials like water or nitrogen or phosphorus, they are recycled throughout the ecosystem. They go through different forms, but they get recycled and used over and over again. They don't really get used up permanently. And one important type of organism that helps in this are decomposers. Decomposers are fungi and bacteria that take dead organisms or waste material, break it down, and return those nutrients back to the soil so they can be recycled through the ecosystem. Some examples of nutrient cycles. This is the water cycle, right? We have water that's in the atmosphere. It falls to the earth as precipitation, rain or snow. When it gets to the earth, some of it goes into the ground, some of it goes into streams and rivers. That water can end up in lakes or in the ocean. It can then evaporate back into the atmosphere. So we have this water that's just cycled over and over again through these various pools that it has. Okay? So that water is being recycled. The water you drink in your water bottle today could have been, dinosaur urine millions of years ago. It's the same water that's been in circulation on the earth for millions and millions of years. So enjoy that glass of dinosaur pee. Other materials work in the same way. Oxygen gets recycled, right? We know that we, animals and other organisms, take in oxygen, use it for cellular respiration, and a byproduct is carbon dioxide. Producers can take in carbon dioxide for photosynthesis and release oxygen. So these materials get recycled. We store some of this carbon in our bodies as well. It goes into making the tree grow or into growing muscle on the cow. And so carbon and oxygen are another example of these cycles. Here we see carbon. Now, we'll talk about in our next section about we are affecting the carbon cycle significantly by taking carbon that's stored deep in the ground in fossil fuels, burning it, and then releasing it into the atmosphere, leading to climate change. Nitrogen gets cycled through various sources. 78% of the atmosphere is actually made of nitrogen, but it's a form that most organisms, they can't use it. We can't get nitrogen just by breathing in air. Only a very specific type of organism can. Certain bacteria are able to grab that nitrogen from the atmosphere and turn it into a more usable form. And plants take that up, and we eat plants to get nitrogen, or we eat other animals, and that's how we get the nitrogen we need to survive. But again, this nitrogen is cycled. Some of it's in plants, some is in the soil, much of it's in the atmosphere, and it goes through these various steps and these processes being transformed from one form to another, but it's really all the same nitrogen. It just gets cycled through these various ways. Same thing with phosphorus. One of the last topics for us to talk about in this section is succession, not the HBO series, but a process that happens in ecosystems. If you imagine, imagine your backyard. Let's say your backyard, you went on strike and you stopped mowing the yard, and your parents didn't mow the yard, and nobody mowed your backyard. What would that look like by the end of the summer?
The grass would be really high.
Grass would be really high. How about if you went on strike for mowing the lawn for 5 years? What would it look like after 5 years? Would it just be longer grass, or would it be different?
That grow in there.
What's that?
There might be other plants that grew in there.
Yeah, other types of plants might grow in there. Maybe like some shrubs or like some bushes might start growing in there. How about if you waited 20 years or 50 years or 100 years? Would it stay? What would eventually, if you came back in the future 200 years later in your backyard, it was left undisturbed, what would it be like? Any idea?
Maybe a forest.
Yeah, in our area, it would be a forest, right? That's that process that would take your backyard from a little backyard that you have now to a forest. That process is called succession. It's a natural process that takes place over a period of time when the community changes. It changes until it reaches a stage which we call the climax community. The climax community is sort of the final stage that is relatively stable. And in our area, our climax community is typically a forest. If you left your backyard, the grass would grow longer. You'd start to get lots of weeds in the first year. Eventually, some kind of woody plants, maybe some small saplings would start to grow there. Eventually into some small shrubs. Then some maybe fast-growing trees might come in. Then some hardwood trees. But over this process of 100 or 200 years, one species will replace another until here you probably are going to get a beech, birch, and maple forest. That's kind of our climax community where we are. Beech, birch, maple, hardwood forest. And that process is succession. Each species that comes in kind of changes the environment somewhat so that the next species is able to take hold. And then that species somehow modifies conditions and another species can take hold until we get to something stable. The first organisms that come in, like if you imagine a farm, a field and a farm, where there actually were no plants, it was just soil. The first organisms that can start to live and grow there, we call those the pioneer species. There are even, you can, pioneer species can even start to take over bare rock. Like if you ever go hiking in the Adirondacks, you go up to a mountaintop that is just rock, that's bare at the top. You can see sometimes on those rocks growing little lichen, little crusty sort of, they're not really plants, they're something more complex, but these mosses and things like that, they can start to grow right on bare rock. As they grow, though, and start to decompose after they die, they start to build up a really thin layer of soil. And then other plants can come in because there's some soil now. And as those plants grow and die and decompose, the soil builds up even thicker and other plants can come. So this process repeated over and over again, that's the process of succession. Even like ponds can go through this process where they gradually fill in with sediment and plants over time, and a pond ecosystem can succeed into a forest ecosystem. And so we can see that here in these diagrams. They show sort of this bare rock going through this process of succession, where you then have lichens and small plants and larger plants and small trees and so forth. And ecosystems can return to their climax after a disturbance. If a forest fire goes through the ecosystem, that's going to reset this process of succession, but eventually that ecosystem should return to its climax community. By mowing your lawn every week, you're basically resetting succession back at the beginning. And if you stop, eventually, succession will take over. Now, in our area, I said our typical ecosystem is hardwood forest, temperate forest, deciduous forest. Now, if you were somewhere else in the world, it might be a different ecosystem. If you were up a little bit farther north of us or up in the mountains a bit, it might be a conifer forest of, spruce trees and fir trees, an evergreen forest. Or if you go up into Canada, for example, from us, then your climax community is going to be different species. If you continue farther north, okay, it might be a tundra ecosystem. That's the climax community. If you go farther to the Midwest of the United States, a grassland is our climax community. If you go into the Southwest, where it's drier and hotter, a desert is the climax community. If you go into Central America, a tropical rainforest might be the climax community. So the type of community, we call those things biomes, and they depend on climate, right? They depend on the temperature and the precipitation. Different combinations of those factors lead to different biomes forming, because different plants and animals are adapted to different conditions. And this diagram kind of shows that, where if we have high temperatures on average and a high level of precipitation, that leads to the formation of tropical rainforests. Okay, if we just keep the temperature high, but we reduce precipitation by going down, then we have the tropical seasonal forest, the savanna, like you might find, in Africa, parts of Asia, or if you go even drier, you're in the desert. Or if we look at temperature, you go from the tropical rainforest to the temperate forest where we are, to the taiga, which is the conifer forest, to the tundra, by reducing temperature and moisture. So different conditions result in different biomes forming. And you can see different biomes have different animals that are associated with them, obviously. The animals that live in the tundra are quite different than the animals that live in the desert. They have specific adaptations that allow them to be successful in their specific environment. But one of the things we'll talk about in the next section is as we as humans change the climate of the earth, right, we're changing these patterns, and that animals that were once adapted to living in a certain geographic area, if that area changes significantly, they're no longer maybe well adapted to those conditions and may not be able to survive, or may have to migrate to where they better match those conditions. So when we think about ecology, one concept that we talk about a lot is this concept of biodiversity. Biodiversity is the number of different species that can live and survive in an area. Some biomes have a very high biodiversity. Can you think of a biome like we were just talking about? Where do you find a very high diversity of living things? Can you tell me an ecosystem where you find lots of different plants and animals and so forth?
A forest.
Yeah, specifically what type of forest has the greatest biodiversity? Yeah, the tropical rainforest is one of the most diverse ecosystems there is. Oceans are very diverse ecosystems. Coral reefs are very diverse. What we're talking about when we use those words is biodiversity, the number of different organisms that can live there. And the more organisms, the more types of living things we have in an area, the more stable it is, right? Because you have lots of different organisms that might be able to survive a disturbance or a disease or a pest or something like that. Problem is humans are reducing biodiversity throughout the world by destroying habitat, especially by converting forest into farmland. Humans are reducing habitat, and that reduces species. We are at record levels of species extinction now because of human impacts on the environment. And if we do this, if we reduce biodiversity, there are significant impacts, right? If a species becomes extinct, its place in the food web is removed, and that could impact other species as well. If we have fewer types of species, disease can spread more easily through an ecosystem. Also, some of these species that become extinct, they could have value to humans, right? We're going to talk about in the lab, the medicines to treat cancer have been found in plants that were growing in the tropical rainforest. Okay? Important cancer-fighting drugs have been discovered in nature. And so if we cause species to go extinct, if we have these severe negative impacts on the ecosystem, well, we may not, those beneficial organisms may be lost. And we can't always predict what would happen when a species becomes extinct or when a species is removed from an area. And we'll learn more about this tomorrow when we talk about the wolves. But here's another example. Mountain lions. Mountain lions were hunted in different areas to almost extinction. And here are some of the effects as the mountain lions were removed, that reduced predators on deer. So deer populations increased. As deer populations increase, they require more food. So they overbrowse the plants, reducing the level of plants in the ecosystem. As there were less plants available, there were less roots holding onto the soil eroded more quickly. Okay? As the soil erodes more quickly, there's less plants available. As there's less plants available, there can't be as many deer supported. So we see these effects of one species can be unpredictable throughout the entire ecosystem. And so when humans are damaging ecosystems and causing species extinction, we can't really be sure what the eventual effects might be. We can measure biodiversity in a couple ways. Don't worry too much about this, but one thing we look at is how many different species are there in an area. Are there 15 different species of trees? Are there 20? Are there 2? Or there's another factor that's a little more complicated, but maybe a little bit more useful, called species evenness. And that's not just how many species there are, but how evenly distributed are those species. If I look at these two pictures you have, don't worry about the math, right? Community 1 and Community 2. They both have 4 different types of trees there. But if we look, Community 2 is dominated by this lighter green colored tree. There are some other trees in there, but the vast majority is this tree, 70% of the trees. Whereas Community 1 has a much more even distribution of those species. Okay. So Community 1 would be most likely to survive some sort of disturbance or something because there's an even distribution of those species. One thing ecologists do is they go out into so they can measure the diversity of the ecosystem. They could go out and sample plants and animals and see how many different living species are there, how evenly distributed are they. Any questions about that? So that's the end of this section of our ecology notes. The next section of our unit is actually about more specifically the human impacts on the environment, but for now, this is the basics of sort of the science of ecology.